Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show where we discuss what's going on in the world from a pure, no-compromise, principled libertarian perspective. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I think that what we're going to talk about is a bit of a trip abroad.
Very true. I thought we'd talk about, Donald Trump's trade antics abroad is how I would put it. I mean, this is really a weird deal, Richard. You've got a president of the United States that is going into foreign nations acting as if he's some sort of proponent or representative of American businesses, where he's over there, as their advocate. Is this really the role of a president, where the president is acting as agent for American businesses? Why can't American businessmen handle their own business affairs without having the president act as their cheerleader, or really as their agent, their promoter, their advancer? And he goes over there and he argues against the fundamental principle of free trade. I mean, it's really ironic to see a Chinese communist dictator that's over there arguing for free trade. Now, you and I, of course, are against these trade agreements. You don't need trade agreements. If you believe in freedom and economic liberty and the principles of free trade, you just unilaterally drop your trade restrictions. You don't need any treaties or so forth. But Trump has that mindset. Oh no, we have to negotiate, because in trade there's winners and there's losers, and America's been taken advantage of by all these third world countries around the world, and he's gonna make America great by getting out of all the free trade agreements and essentially just make America a protectionist nation, put walls around us, isolate America, and all in this quest that he's gonna make America great again by isolating it from the rest of the world. And so it's really kind of tragic that you've got a president that's arguing in favor of anti-freedom concepts, anti-free trade concepts. It's really bizarre. I don't see how this inures to America's benefit or the benefit of the American people. It might help some particular business here and there, but in terms of the American economy, the American consumer, this is really a tragedy. What do you think?
Well, I think that we should realize that what Donald Trump has been saying on this trip to East Asia, this 12-day trip, while the language is more direct, less subtle, more in your face, for decades upon decades upon decades, certainly during a good part of the post-World War II period since 1945, when presidents have traveled abroad, even if his entourage only included the secretary for this and the secretary to that is several members of his cabinet and his staff and, quote, his consulting experts at the White House itself, it has been the case that the United States government has been an agent, an active promoter of trying to sell and arrange business and contracts for American entrepreneurs who want to do business abroad and who seem to either be unwilling or unable to make the deals themselves. Even if we go back to, let's say, the immediate post-war period, I'm just trying to put this in a little bit of context, and the issue came up of the Marshall Plan, that is U.S. Economic aid and support and, quote, loans in some cases, to the defeated and now greatly destroyed European countries that were becoming our post-World War II allies. Most of this money that we, quote, lent them or gave them had a string attached to it. And what was that string? If we give you X millions of dollars to rebuild your country, most or all of those dollars have to be respent on buying American goods, manufactured goods, inputs, raw materials, machinery, equipment, various quote essential consumer items. Well, you, the farm country, are getting back on your feet. So this is nothing new. This has been sort of the modus operandi of every government in the post-war period. Now, it may have been done more aggressively, more subtly. Some president may have been involved in doing less of it, another more of it, but the presumption is that this is now the role of the United States president. He is the sales rep for American business abroad. Now Trump, he relishes this because of his economic nationalism and his myopic and a view of the naive view of the individual businessman. If you look at the world from an individual businessman's point of view, and all things are set aside, blinders are put around everything else, then of course, if your competitor gets the consumer's business, you lose. His gain is your loss. His market share is your loss of an economic opportunity. Winners and losers. It is only when you take those blinders off and the naive mercantilist, that is 18th century view of the world of the mercantilists, of this a zero-sum game of if a business gains a contract or gains a business, some other business lose, is realize that there's a global international division of labor. And American businesses find their niche and what products they can have a comparative advantage in supplying better and newer and less expensively than their rivals to satisfy both consumers that geographically on the boundaries of the country happen to be your home country versus trading in the rest of the world. But Trump has these blinders that America either gets the business or somebody else gets the business. And if somebody else gets a business, it's not because in that division of labor, this American enterpriser just doesn't have that niche to satisfy consumer demands. He needs to redirect himself to find a different expertise to be specializing in to earn revenues. He can't see that way. So instead, he constantly saying, well, look, and this idea of one-on-one balance of trades. We're buying more from you than you're buying from us. We're a loser. We're buying more from you than you're buying from us. We're a loser. And therefore, country by country by country, he has to negotiate to show that what's a winner. What's a winner? You're buying more of our stuff than we're buying yours. Now, I personally have a terrible balance of trade deficit with virtually the entire world. Because if we compare how many people spend a large chunk of their money on my economic services, viewers and listeners, particularly for years, but I have a calm, deliberative personality, and I bear the burden of this.
Hey, the Future Freedom Foundation buys your services not at a very high price, but what the heck?
Charity. It's charity. Anyway, bad. You're bad. Okay, so if you look at there's certain people who spend their income buying my services. Students through their tuition, some people who pay for what I lecture on or write. And then I spend the income I've earned from those who have valued my services on all the other things that as a consumer I want to buy. My food, my clothes, the house in which I live, the coffee which I sip on while we're doing these things, Jacob. But how many of those people who make the coffee, who make the clothes I wear, the glasses I wear, the food I eat, have actually taken an active desire in buying my economic services? Hardly any, if any. So as a consequence, I have a balance of trade surplus with maybe one or two, and I have a huge balance of trade deficit with the rest of the world in that I'm buying more of everybody else's stuff than they as individuals are buying of mine. It doesn't matter. As long as I earn income by someone who valued my services and with whom therefore I had a balance of trade surplus, they bought more of my economics services than I bought of their particular product in value terms. I then can spend it on all the other things that people don't want to buy from me. And on net, my expenditures are limited by the income, the fact that some desire what I'm producing, regardless if others do not. Now that's how the global economy works. That's how the U.S. economy works. There are countries that buy more from us than we buy from them, and there are countries that we buy more from them than they buy from us. The important is the net balance of trade. The fact that what I earn from all sources limits, constrains, as my budget, what I can buy from everyone else. Regardless of whether one-on-one I have a balance of trade surplus, a balance of trade deficit, or a trade balance with each and every one of the individuals, or we as a nation, the other countries with which we trade. Now Trump doesn't understand this. He has never escaped, assuming he ever even attempted to try, from the out-of-date and primitive and backward thinking of the mercantilists of the 17th and 18th century, who viewed trade in that way. In other words, he has leapt over and returned to the entire thinking of the mercantilists and ignored all the enlightened thinking of the economists of the last 250 years.
Yeah, I was particularly struck when you said that Trump's serving as a sales rep for all these businesses. I mean, you're absolutely right. But even more telling, he's serving as a direct rep for the arms industry. I mean, he's over there trying to sell weaponry, saying, oh, well, this will make America great. I mean, this is so bizarre. I wonder if they're paying him a commission on the sales. And it's ironic, Richard, that you got all these people on the left that are calling for gun control, but not one of them, as far as I know, is criticizing Trump for going abroad selling as many weapons as he possibly can. And your reference to a sales rep also brought to mind Smedley Butler. You know, this is the highly decorated military general, Army general, World War I think, and so forth, where he writes his book War is a Racket after he gets out of the military. And I think he was the most widely decorated Marine in U.S. history or something like that. But he writes this book saying, you know, all these interventions in Latin America that, I forget what his exact words were, but he says, we were just gunmen. I was a gunman enforcing, trying to help out American corporations and businesses in Latin America. And the classic example of that, of course, is the Guatemala intervention in *54. Now, you know, they made out the president of Guatemala, who was democratically elected, Jacobo Arbenz, to be a communist, and the big thing was he was reaching out to the Russians in a spirit of peace and friendship, which was considered a grave threat to national security. But it was also just a coincidence that United Fruit was down there, big corporation where CIA members and had connections, and congressmen had stock certificates in the corporation. So they intervened to get United Fruit some of its land back from the Guatemalan government that had nationalized it. I mean, this is really what U.S. trade policy's been always all about. Now let's look at the ideal. Here in the United States, you have this gigantic free trade zone. I mean, there are no trade restrictions between each state. I mean, you know, how many people pace the floors at night unable to sleep because there's a trade deficit between Florida and Virginia? I mean, just yeah. I mean, you know, nobody cares that. I mean, I don't know which way it goes, or I would assume that Virginians are buying more from Florida than vice versa, because a lot of Virginians go down, spend money in Disney World. But who cares? Nobody cares. And it didn't have to be that way. The framers in the Constitution could have said, no, every state's going to be able to have trade barriers, where the governor would be like Trump, going into other states saying, buy from Virginia, buy from Tennessee. And, well, they sort of do that today. But they can't erect trade barriers. And everybody benefits from that. That's the way it should be internationally. Now, people say, well, what happens if another nation doesn't do it and the United States does do it? Great. That's fine. I mean, just free the American people to travel and trade wherever they want. And if some nation says, well, we don't want American businessmen, so be it. They go elsewhere. Or suppose some nation's giving subsidies to their businesses. Okay. I mean, that's their business. It's harmful to their citizenry. But again, don't use that as the excuse for saying, well, we got to shoot ourselves in the foot over here too by taking away the liberty of the American people. So really the solution to this is a separation of economy and the state. There's that old French saying, Richard, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Let it be. Let it pass. Don't get government interfering or helping anyone.
No, Let It Be was a Beatles song. You see, he gets going on this, and it ruins the entire movie. See, the viewers, that's terrible. But the thing that needs to be perhaps emphasized is that the very things that you were just saying. What if another country refuses to accept American goods? They wish to export to us, but they don't want to import. So let's take the extreme case. Well, on the one hand, if another country wants us to take their goods, but demand nothing in return for them. In fact, they have given the productions of their people for free. It's a gift. You don't have to pay for it. Now, you might say, but wait, they took dollars in exchange for those goods. Well, if they don't spend the dollars, let's suppose the dollars just sit in either private vaults or the government's vaults, it doesn't get spent. The claim against our goods as payment for what they have produced and sold to us never gets made. Or if they sell those dollars on the foreign exchange market to someone else, then we're just exporting to another person who is now using those dollars, having been sold to them, as opposed to the initial person who sold us goods. But at the end of the day, we either get a free good or someone just ends up spending the dollars. And therefore our imports are financed by our exports. Let's take the other case of the foreign government that subsidizes their producers so they can less costly export their goods to the United States. Now, Americans now find themselves with a foreign alternative product offered at a price less than, let's say, the American domestic version of it. They buy the product, they have money left over in their pocket that is then enabling them to buy other things that previously they couldn't afford. That's called a rising standard of living. Now, let us suppose that the lower priced foreign good had not been subsidized, but had just been due to the foreign producer developing more cost-efficient ways to bring his product to market. Nobody would complain about that in principle. The American producer, in the competition of the race of the marketplace, had just failed in matching his rival, and he doesn't keep the market share. But even if the foreign government has subsidized that foreign seller's ability to sell less here in the United States than otherwise would be the case, we're still better off. We've been given a free gift of a subsidized good. Who should be complaining about that? The taxpayers of that foreign country. They're the ones whose wealth has been partly extracted from them through taxes and redistributed, a redistribution of wealth through the government to the selected and privileged industries who want their costs to be covered partly so they can sell goods in the United States at a lower price. It's the foreign citizens and taxpayers of that country that should be complaining. We're the beneficiaries of them being the suckers of their own government's politics.
Well, let's look at the ideal. I mean, the ideal really, from our perspective, the libertarian perspective, the pro-freedom perspective, would be for the United States to just drop all trade restrictions, all trade barriers, dismantle all the embargoes against Cuba and North Korea and Iran, Russia, and all the rest of the countries. Just totally liberate the American private sector. Now, who would benefit from this? Well, clearly the consumer benefits from this. I mean, and seller too. He's got wide open markets. He doesn't have to worry about American bureaucrats anymore. He can go into Cuba, make deals. The consumers benefit because they have the entire world that is able to flood the United States with products that provide more choices for people. Now, some people would say, oh, this just isn't practical. We could never do such a thing. Well, that's ridiculous. For one thing, it's been accomplished here domestically. As I said earlier, it didn't have to be that way. It still doesn't have to be that way. I mean, you could amend the Constitution to provide that every state can make its own state great, like Trump wants to, by having the authority to erect trade barriers against all the other states. I mean, if let's face it, if Trump's philosophy is correct, why shouldn't it be applied at the state level? How about the county level? You know, every county can now erect trade barriers against every other county. Well, I think people know instinctively that this would be a really bad thing for Americans domestically. The same principle applies internationally. Is that people have this blind spot that all of a sudden, oh my gosh, if we're dealing with people of another country rather than another state, everything changes. And Richard, you and I both know that it is a practical solution. We saw it in England in the 19th century when Richard Cobden and John Bright led the free trade movement in there. And you and I have pointed out in the past that the leaders of that free trade movement were poor people. It wasn't the upper classes that were clamoring for free trade. It was the poor. They understood the argument. They understood that when government gets involved in trying to protect the country or make the country great with trade barriers, it hurts those at the bottom of the economic ladder. I would love to see that here. I mean, if England could accomplish it, why is it then an impractical solution? Why is it that America can't do it? And especially with people at the bottom of the economic ladder helping us lead the way to economic liberty.
Just let me sort of amplify this last point that you made. Americans perhaps are not as historically educated as they could be, but certainly not about foreign events, foreign countries. And the fact that in 1846, the British Parliament voted, both in the House of Commons and then through the vote in the House of Lords, to unilaterally abolish all of the agricultural protectionist restrictions in Great Britain that were prohibiting or limiting the amount of foreign food that could be brought into the British Isles. They had lowered some manufacturing restrictions already, but in 1846, June of 1846, they unilaterally abolished the bulk of their trade restrictions, particularly on agricultural goods. And their philosophy was that was, regardless of what other countries did, if free trade is good, then we should practice it, even if other countries choose to maintain their trade barriers. Now, Britain's unilateral policy soon brought about a great economic benefit, because partly this was occurring during famines in Great Britain. They'd had heavy rains, the crops had been destroyed, people were starving in both Great Britain and Ireland, because Ireland was part of the British Empire at the time. And this enabled a flood of less expensive foreign food to come in and alleviate the hardships and the starvation and the poverty. And that enabled the country just to get back on its feet and start growing even more industrially than was the case. And Britain's example of unilateral free trade then set the example for other countries in Europe to, if not abolish their trade restrictions completely, then to see the benefit of lowering them, also either unilaterally or to enter into more trade agreements for mutual lowering of barriers. The consequence was that by the 1870s, it is not an exaggeration to say that virtually all of the major European countries, small and large, had basically established a free trade zone for most of the European continent among the major Western and Central European countries. And in the case of Great Britain, practiced unilateral free trade throughout the British Empire. Anyone could go, let's say, to British India and to buy, sell, invest, reside, manufacture without restriction on the same equality of rights before the law of the free trade policy as an English subject. This was a great boon for both the British, the countries that were as part of the British Empire, and for the rest of the world, who therefore had open entree to participate in a vast area for rising standards of living through a mutually shared global division of labor. That's how mass rising standards of living, growth of population that were able to be fed, occurred basically through unilateral free trade with Britain's example, or if not always in that case, seeing the benefit of at least negotiating, not restrictions, well, I'll let this domestic content, but you have to let that domestic content. No, just lower them and let's go. So that is a model, an historical, a model and experience that should be held up as an example for ourselves.
Yeah, what was really interesting about the free trade movement and Cobden and Bright was that they were fighting for their principles at the same time that Bastiat was fighting his principles in France. Now, most libertarians are familiar with Frederick Bastiat. He's got some fantastic books, including a great little book called The Law. But his economics books are fantastic. Economic sophisms, economic harmonies, political economy. And he, as I understand it, Richard, Bastiat even went to England to meet with Cobden and Bright, figure out what they were doing, because he wasn't meeting with the same success in gaining popularity for his ideas in France as Cobden and Bright did. And ironically, Bastiat, his writings have continued to serve as a great inspiration for libertarians today, while Cobden and Bright are sort of forgotten figures. But Cobden and Bright showed the practicality of these ideas on liberty and how they can prevail among a citizenry. Just because people consider the idea and they say, yeah, this is fantastic. And you showed me many years ago, as part of that free trade movement, that photograph of people arguing for free trade. It was a big protest movement, and most of them were poor people, and they had that cannon that said "free trade or this," that
was Daniel O'Connell, a member of the British Parliament from County Kerry in Ireland, and he would lead demonstrations in Ireland with that. People pulling a real cannon, not loaded, but with the sign saying "free trade" or this, just as the extremity with which they believed that the free trade would make the people better off. Or there was often graffiti on the walls of buildings in various parts of England during that famine, in which kids wrote the following phrases: "I be protected and I be starved." So, in fact, yes. Cobden and Bright themselves came from the middle class of business segments of the society, but their appeal, their support, even some financial support through very small contributions, or as donations as they would call them, came from a vast number of those in what was called the lower class, or the working class, precisely because they had persuaded them that freedom of trade would be the vehicle by which their standards of living could be improved, rather than continue to protect the agricultural profits of the landed aristocracy. And what they said turned out to be true, and opened a great door for not just British, but human economic progress.
All right. Well, in the last few minutes that we have left, let's talk about a point that we often hear, that you have American businesses that are closing down operations in the United States or reducing them and moving into foreign countries where they hire cheap labor. And the Trumpistas say, oh, this is really bad for America. We need to put the clamps down on this. We have to prohibit American businesses from doing this. And the way I look at it, Richard, this is part of what freedom's about. I mean, you have a right to open a business or not open a business. I mean, that's your decision. And where you open a business, it's your business. It's your right. It's no business of the government to tell you where you should be doing this and not doing this. Now, it's clear that a pure, unhampered market economy, which is what we argue for, one where government's not being involved at all, that there's shifts. There's shifts in consumer taste. There's businesses that are losing market share because of a shift in consumer wants. There's businesses going out of business. It's what the economist Schumpeter called creative destructionism. But overall, we see that the economy standards of living rise. So people in a particular line of work may lose their jobs because an American business says, hey, I find it more efficient to go into Mexico and use workers there. But then American business, those American employees that have lost their job, then shift into more productive, possibly higher paying jobs because of the efficiencies that are brought about by everybody seeking the most efficient outcome for their business. So when government tries to protect these privileged groups, actually they may be helping out that privileged business, but they're doing a disservice to the American people generally, because standards of living start compressing, they start devolving, they start reducing, rather than the other way around, which is what we want, rising standards of living.
Yes, just to amplify that, if Trump's logic and those who think like him, as you were just expressing it, were true, then people should call for trade barriers between countries, because an industry declines in one state and jobs are lost, and those workers then have to shift, and sometimes they not only have to shift what kind of work they do, but their geographical location. The fact is that at the beginning of the 20th century, about 80% of the American workforce was involved in employments related broadly, directly and indirectly, with agriculture. As the 20th century progressed, particularly the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, through mechanization of agriculture, machines could do the work in farming to replace dozens, hundreds of hands per machine. Now, workers lost their jobs, or if someone retired, their son, in the sense of the traditional sense of the son following the father, didn't stay in that line of work. They moved to the city. They went into a factory, manufacturing, or some profession. And the population had to shift what they did, where they did, and for whom they were producing. But that's called economic progress. Would we want to keep people working where they are in the particular location that they were born in, at the work that their fathers had done? Because if we want that, then we are stuck with the standard of living of that earlier time. We are the beneficiaries within this broad free trade zone of free movement of goods and men, as you were saying, Jacob, that for 200 years, innovation, technology, new products, cost efficiencies have enabled more goods to come on the market, better goods on the market, less expensive goods on the market, raising our standards of living. And people have merely adapted to these new economic changes and opportunities to create the distribution of our labor force today. And we all have benefited from that. And if we continue to have at least that sufficient degree of freedom of men, money, and goods across borders within the United States, we will continue to have at least some type of the growth that our forefathers took for granted.
Yeah, a good example of the phenomenon you're talking about was the automobile industry. I mean, when it came into existence, it was hurting the buggy whip industry, and the buggy whip industry was starting to go out of business, and there were a lot of people who lost their jobs. Does that hurt those people? Of course. I mean, it never feels good to lose your job. But by the same token, the automobile industry started creating all kinds of new job opportunities, repairing the automobiles, selling the automobiles, and so forth, where people could shift and then find themselves actually having a higher standard of living than before. So on that note, did you want to say something? On that note, we're out of time, Richard. It's always a pleasure. If people want to get more information on what we're talking about, come to visit us at fff.org, drop us emails at fff.org. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the visit.
Wonderful being with you, and as I always do, I want to thank our viewers and listeners for sharing some of their time with us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.